Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I met my ex-husband in college. We were both studying business, and he seemed like the perfect guy back then. Ambitious, charming, and he said all the right things about wanting a family someday. We got married after graduation, bought a little house in the suburbs, and had our son a few years later. For a while, everything seemed perfect, but when our son turned 8, things started changing. My husband became suspicious of everything I did. If I talked to the mailman for more than 30 seconds, he'd interrogate me about it later. If I smiled at the cashier at the grocery store, he'd accuse me of flirting. It got to the point where I was walking on eggshells in my own home. I asked him why he was being like this, telling him I hadn't done anything wrong. He said I was always too friendly with other men and it made him uncomfortable. I tried explaining that I was just being polite and that's how normal people act. He shot back that normal people don't act like that when they're married. I started to think maybe I was a problem. Maybe I was being too friendly. Maybe I should tone it down. But then I caught him texting someone late at night, hiding his phone screen whenever I walked by. When I asked about it, he got defensive and accused me of being paranoid. 2 months later, I found out he was having an affair with a woman from his office. I saw the messages on his laptop when he forgot to close it. Detailed conversations about their weekend trips together, complaints about how boring his home life was, and plans to meet up while I thought he was working late. I confronted him immediately, and he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he turned it around on me. He said this was exactly why he went looking elsewhere, claiming I was always suspicious and controlling. He then had the nerve to say that maybe if I trusted him more, he wouldn't have felt the need to find someone who actually appreciated him. That was it for me. I packed a bag, took our son, and stayed with my parents while I filed for divorce. I knew I had to protect our son from the ugliness of the situation, so when he asked why we were getting divorced, I kept it simple. I told him that sometimes adults just grow apart, and it doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. He wanted to know why we couldn't just fix it, and I explained that some things can't be fixed, but that his dad and I both love him very much, and that would never change. He never seemed satisfied with that answer, but I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want him to hate his father or think badly of him. Kids need their parents, even flawed ones. The divorce went through and we settled on joint custody. My ex got our son every other weekend and one evening during the week. For years, this arrangement worked fine. My son would come back from his dad's house in good spirits, and we never had any major issues. Then, about 6 months ago, I started dating someone new. He's a good man, patient and kind, and he's been great with my son. I was careful not to introduce them too quickly, and I made sure my son was comfortable with the relationship before moving forward. That's when everything changed. Last week, my son came home from his dad's house and seemed upset. When I asked what was wrong, he asked me why I cheated on dad. I was shocked and told him I never cheated on his father, asking where he got that idea. He said his dad told him the truth about the divorce. According to his father, I had gotten paranoid and started accusing him of things. And then, I cheated on him with some guy from work. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. All these years, I protected his father's reputation, and this is how he repaid me. I told my son that wasn't what happened at all, and that his father was the one who cheated. That's why we got divorced. But my son said his dad told him I made up stories about him to make myself feel better about what I did. I told him I had proof and could show him the messages I found. I was furious, but I kept my voice calm for my son's sake. I could see he was confused and hurt, and I didn't want to make it worse by losing my temper. The next day, I called my ex-husband and demanded an explanation. I asked him how he dared to lie to our son about what happened between us. He claimed he didn't lie about anything and that he told him the truth. I reminded him that he was the one who cheated on me and that I had the messages to prove it. He brushed it off, saying I was still hung up on something that happened years ago, and maybe if I had been a better wife, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. He said he was tired of me playing the victim and accused me of parading my new boyfriend around, like I was rubbing it in his face. I told him I wasn't parading anyone around, and that I'd been nothing but respectful about keeping my personal life separate from our co-parenting arrangement. He dismissed my words and said our son deserved to know what kind of mother he had. That's when he started screaming at me, using language I won't repeat. When I told him I was going to tell our son the truth, he started cursing at his own child over the phone. He called our son an ungrateful little brat and said if he believed my lies, he didn't deserve to have him as a father anyway. I hung up on him and sat down with my son that evening. I showed him the old messages, explained what really happened, and answered all his questions honestly. He was shocked, then angry, then heartbroken. He asked me if all this time I let him think it might have been my fault. I explained that I thought I was protecting him and didn't want him to think badly of his father. He realized that his dad was willing to let him think badly of me instead. My son decided he didn't want to visit his father anymore. When my ex found out, all hell broke loose. The first call came from my former mother-in-law. She screamed at me about how I dared to turn her grandson against his father, calling me a vindictive witch who couldn't stand to see others happy. I told her I didn't turn anyone against anyone, and that I simply told him the truth. She said my so-called truth was just my twisted version of events and that her son would never do what I was accusing him of. I offered to show her the proof, but she said she didn't want to see my fabricated evidence and that I was going to regret this. Then my ex-sister-in-law started calling my parents, telling them I was a horrible mother who was using my son as a weapon against his father. She called them multiple times a day, leaving nasty voicemails when they stopped answering. The worst part came 2 weeks later when my ex-husband showed up at my house, drunk and angry. My boyfriend was there, which only made things worse. He accused me of thinking I could just steal his son from him and asked if I thought my new boyfriend could replace him. I told him nobody was trying to replace him and that he did this to himself. He yelled that I poisoned our son against him and filled his head with lies. My boyfriend told him he needed to leave because he was drunk and scaring everyone. My ex got even angrier and told him not to dare tell him what to do in front of his own son. That's when things got physical. My ex shoved my boyfriend, who defended himself but tried to de-escalate the situation. My son was watching from upstairs, terrified. I called the police while my boyfriend kept my ex from getting more violent. When the officers arrived, they escorted him off the property and warned him about trespassing and disturbing the peace. I decided to tell my son everything that happened because I realized that lying to him in the first place was what got us into this mess. A few days later, Karen called me one more time. She begged me not to press charges against her son, promising they would all leave me alone if I just dropped it. I told her I'd think about it, but only if the harassment stopped completely. Since then, they've all gone quiet. The police visit seemed to be the wake-up call they needed. My son has gone completely no contact with his biological father and seems to be processing everything as well as can be expected. He's angry about being lied to for so long, but he understands why I did it. I've kept records of everything they did, just in case they decide to start up again. But for now, we're finally living in peace, and my son knows the truth about what really happened. My wife and I have been married for 5 years. We have a 3-year-old son and just welcomed our second child last month. My wife's parents live across the country, and we don't see them very often, maybe twice a year at most. They're retired and comfortable spending most of their time traveling or relaxing at home. When we found out our second baby was coming, we knew we'd need help with our toddler during the hospital stay. My wife asked her parents if they could come visit and watch our son while we were having the baby. They agreed and booked their flights to stay with us for 3 weeks. The plan was perfect. They'd arrive a few days before my wife's due date, help during the hospital stay, and then stick around to help us adjust to life with 2 kids. Everything went smoothly at first. My wife went into labor, and we spent 3 days at the hospital. During those 3 days, my mother-in-law and father-in-law took care of our toddler. It was the only time during their entire visit that they were the primary caregivers for him. The rest of the time, I was still doing most of the childcare while they relaxed and visited with us. But then, just when their 3-week visit was coming to an end, I got a phone call that changed everything. My dad had suddenly become very ill and was in the hospital back in my hometown. The doctors weren't sure what was wrong, but it was serious enough that I needed to get there immediately. I was panicking. My wife was barely 2 weeks out from her cesarean section and physically couldn't lift our toddler or handle much of the daily care. Our newborn was still adjusting to life outside the womb. I felt torn between being with my dying father and taking care of my family. That's when my mother-in-law stepped up, or so I thought. She told me not to worry about them and that they could stay a few extra days, maybe even a week if needed. She said my dad needed me right now. My father-in-law agreed completely, telling me they'd take care of everything and that I should just focus on my family back home. I felt so relieved and grateful. I booked the next flight out and rushed to be with my dad. The flight felt endless and I kept praying I'd make it in time to say goodbye. I made it to the hospital just hours before my dad passed away. Seeing him take his last breath was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced. I held his hand and told him I loved him when he slipped away peacefully. My mom was completely devastated, and I knew she needed me there. But then, just hours after my dad died while I was still sitting in the hospital, trying to process what had happened, my phone rang. It was my wife, and she sounded upset. She told me she was sorry about my dad, but then delivered some terrible news. Her parents said they couldn't stay any longer and were taking their original flight the next day. When I asked why, she explained that they said they were tired and wanted to go home. Tired? I had just watched my father die, my mother was falling apart. I hadn't slept in days and they were tired. I asked my wife to put her mom on the phone so I could talk to her directly, but my wife said her parents had already gone to bed and didn't want to be disturbed. The next morning I tried calling the house, but my mother-in-law wouldn't take my calls. So there I was, 36 hours after my dad's funeral, having to leave my grieving mother and fly back home to take care of a newborn and toddler, while my wife recovered from major surgery. I was running on pure adrenaline and grief, but I had no choice. The flight home was a nightmare. I kept thinking about how my mother-in-law had looked me in the eye and promised to stay, only to bail out the moment things got difficult. They didn't even have the decency to tell me themselves. They made my wife, who was still healing from surgery, be the messenger. When I got home, my in-laws were already gone. They had taken their original flight without saying goodbye or even leaving a note. No explanation, no apology, nothing. The next few weeks were brutal. I was juggling a grieving process I couldn't properly experience, sleep deprivation from the newborn, chasing after our toddler, helping my wife heal, and trying to support my mother from across the country. Every day felt like I was drowning. What made it worse was the silence from my in-laws. No phone call to check how we were doing. No text to apologize for leaving us in such a difficult situation. No acknowledgement that they had broken their promise when I needed them most. Then, about 3 weeks later, my mother-in-law called my wife. She told my wife that they were thinking of coming for another visit next month because they missed the babies so much. When my wife told me about their plan to visit, I felt my anger boiling over. I told her, absolutely not. I wasn't ready to see them after what they did. My wife responded that they were her parents and that my refusal made her uncomfortable and overwhelmed. I reminded her how uncomfortable I had felt having to leave my dying mother to come home because her parents couldn't handle a few extra days with their own grandchildren. My wife acknowledged that what they did was awful, but she asked if I could just let it go since they were family. I explained to her that family doesn't abandon you when you need them most. Family keeps their promises. Family at least apologizes when they screw up, but the conversation went in circles. My wife agreed that what her parents did was terrible, but she refused to confront them about it. She expected me to just smile and welcome them back into our home when nothing had happened. I told my wife that I needed them to acknowledge what they did and apologize before I'd be comfortable having them in our house again. I asked if that was really too much to ask. My wife responded that I knew how they were and that they'd never admit they were wrong. I suggested they could stay in a hotel and visit during the day, but that I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. That's when my wife broke down crying, saying I was being unreasonable and making things difficult for everyone. But I stood my ground. Some boundaries are worth maintaining, especially when it comes to people who abandon you during your darkest hour. A few days later, I was surprised when my phone rang and I saw my father-in-law's number. He started the conversation by saying he heard I was upset about them leaving when they did. I told him that upset didn't begin to cover it. They had promised to stay and help, then left me hanging when my dad died. My father-in-law responded that they never signed a contract or anything, and that they did their part by watching my boy while we were in the hospital. I reminded him that his part was keeping his word when I needed help most, and that my wife couldn't even pick up our toddler because of her surgery. He told me that they weren't getting any younger, and that 3 weeks was a long time to be away from home. I pointed out that he was retired and literally had nothing but time. My father-in-law said he didn't appreciate my tone and that they were trying to be generous by visiting again so soon. I asked him what would really be generous, an apology and some acknowledgement that they broke their promise when I needed them most. But he just got defensive and said they had already done enough by helping with the first 3 weeks. The conversation ended badly with him hanging up on me, but something unexpected happened the next day. My wife's younger sister called me. She had heard about everything from my wife and was furious with her parents. My wife's sister told me she was ashamed of what her parents did and that she had given them a piece of her mind. She said she told them they were selfish and cruel for abandoning us during such a terrible time. She also mentioned that she had heard from other family members who were equally disgusted by their behavior. Apparently, word had gotten out about what happened, and my in-laws were facing criticism from multiple family members. My wife's sister said her parents were now claiming they had misunderstood the situation and didn't realize how badly I needed them to stay. A week later, my mother-in-law finally called me directly. She sounded uncomfortable and awkward when she tried to explain that they had been overwhelmed by the situation and made a poor decision in leaving when they did. I listened when she attempted what could barely be called an apology. She said they realized they should have stayed longer and that they felt bad about how things worked out. But even then, she tried to justify their actions by saying they had already been there for 3 weeks and were exhausted. I told her that being tired was no excuse for breaking a promise when someone's father was dying. I explained how her actions had forced me to abandon my grieving mother and return home to care for 2 young children while still processing my own loss. There was a long silence on the phone. Finally, she admitted that they had made a mistake and asked what they could do to make it right. I told her that they needed to understand that their actions had results and that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. I explained that I wasn't ready for them to visit yet, and that when I was ready, they would need to stay in a hotel rather than our home. I also told her that they needed to acknowledge their mistake to my wife and take responsibility for the stress they had caused our family during an already difficult time. My mother-in-law agreed to these conditions, though I could tell she wasn't happy about it. But what really surprised me was what happened next. Word of their behavior had apparently spread beyond just immediate family. My wife told me that her parents had been getting calls from friends asking about what happened when my wife's sister had told some people about the situation. My in-laws, who prided themselves on being seen when helpful and caring grandparents, were now facing social results for their selfish behavior. Several of their friends had expressed disappointment in their actions, and they were clearly embarrassed by the negative attention. In the end, they did visit a month later, but they stayed in a hotel when I had requested. The visit was awkward and tense, but they made an effort to help more than they ever had before. They also made a point of apologizing to both my wife and me in person, though it felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. I'm a third-generation American. My grandparents came here from Lebanon in the 1960s, but my parents were born here, I was born here, and I've never lived anywhere else. I speak English better than Arabic. I root for the local football team, and I love apple pie just like any other American. But my darker skin and beard make some people think otherwise. This happened 3 days before Christmas last year. I've been putting off getting a tree because work had been crazy, but my wife kept reminding me that our kids were getting anxious about not having one up yet. So after finishing my shift at the hospital, where I work as a nurse, I drove straight to the Christmas tree lot downtown. When I got there around 7 p.m., they were almost sold out. The guy running the lot told me they only had 3 trees left, and 2 of them were pretty scraggly. But there was one decent Douglas fir that looked perfect for our living room. It was exactly what I needed. I was inspecting the tree, checking for bare spots and making sure it was fresh, when this woman walked up. She was probably in her 50s, wearing an expensive-looking coat and carrying a designer purse. She looked at the tree I was examining and then looked at me. The woman asked me if I was buying that tree. I told her yeah. I was just making sure it was good quality first. She told me she needed that tree because she'd been coming to this lot for 15 years. I apologized but explained that I got here first and pointed out the 2 other trees she could look at instead. She complained that those trees were garbage and said she needed this one for her Christmas party tomorrow. She claimed she was a regular customer. I explained that I understood she wanted a nice tree, but I was there first and I was buying this one. That's when her whole attitude changed. She looked me up and down and told me I didn't even look like I celebrated Christmas. She asked why I needed a Christmas tree. I asked her what that was supposed to mean. She said I knew exactly what she meant and claimed this was America, where Americans should get priority for Christmas trees, not people like me. I told her I was American and was born here, just like my parents. She didn't believe me and said she could tell by looking at me that I wasn't from here. She insisted that real Americans should get first pick. I was getting angry now, but I tried to stay calm. I've dealt with this kind of ignorant behavior before. I told her my skin color didn't determine my nationality and that I was buying this tree for my family. I said we were done talking. I turned back to the tree and started untying it from the stand. That's when things got really crazy. She grabbed my shoulder and spun me around, demanding I not walk away from her because she was talking to me. I told her to take her hands off me right now, but instead of backing off, she got more aggressive. She started pushing me away from the tree and screamed that this tree belonged to a real American family, not some terrorist. That word hit me like a slap. I've been called that before and it never gets easier to hear, but I still tried to de-escalate by telling her she needed to calm down and back away from me. Instead of backing away, she completely lost it. She lunged at me with her hands reaching for my throat. This woman was literally trying to strangle me over a Christmas tree. I grabbed her wrists to stop her from choking me, but she was stronger than she looked and absolutely furious. She was screaming at me, calling me all sorts of horrible names while trying to get her hands around my neck. I had no choice but to defend myself. I managed to break her grip and push her back, but she came at me again. This time I had to be more forceful. I grabbed her by the shoulders and threw her to the ground to get her away from me. She hit the pavement hard and started screaming even louder for help. She yelled that I had assaulted her and demanded someone call the police. The lot owner came running over, having heard all the commotion. A few other customers had stopped to watch too. Karen kept screaming that I had attacked her and she wanted me arrested. She told everyone to call the police right now. The lot owner asked what happened. I explained that she tried to strangle me because I was buying this tree and I was just defending myself. Karen claimed I was lying and said I had attacked her for no reason. She insisted she was an innocent woman and I was a thug who assaulted her. She was putting on quite a performance, acting like she was the victim. I was worried the police might believe her version of events. I asked the lot owner if he had security cameras. He said yeah, they had cameras covering the whole lot. Karen said she didn't care about cameras because she knew what happened and demanded they arrest me. The police showed up about 10 minutes later. 2 officers, and they immediately went to talk to Karen first since she was the one screaming and crying. She told them thank God they were there because I had attacked her completely unprovoked. She claimed she was just trying to buy a Christmas tree and I assaulted her. One officer said they needed to hear my side of the story. I explained that she tried to strangle me because she thought I didn't deserve to buy a Christmas tree. I told them she said Americans should get priority and that I don't look American enough. I explained that when I tried to leave with the tree I was buying, she grabbed me and put her hands around my throat and I only pushed her away to defend myself. Karen insisted that was completely false and that she never touched me. She accused me of lying. The second officer asked the lot owner if he had cameras that would have recorded the incident. The owner confirmed he did and said he'd get the footage for them. While we waited, Karen kept insisting that I had attacked her for no reason. She demanded that they arrest me immediately and kept making comments about how I probably wasn't even a legal citizen. When the lot owner came back with his laptop, we all gathered around to watch the footage. The cameras had captured everything perfectly. You could clearly see Karen approaching me, starting the argument, and then grabbing me and attempting to choke me. You could see me trying to get away and only using force when she wouldn't stop attacking me. The officers watched it twice to make sure they saw everything correctly. The first officer told Karen that the footage clearly showed her initiating physical contact and attempting to strangle me. He said I was defending myself. Karen claimed the video was fake and accused me of paying them to edit it. The second officer told her she was under arrest for assault and battery. Karen said it was ridiculous and they couldn't arrest her because she was the victim. They put handcuffs on her while she screamed about how unfair it was and how I didn't deserve to be in America. Some of the other customers were shaking their heads in disgust at her behavior. The first officer asked me if I wanted to press charges. I told him absolutely. They loaded Karen into the police car while she continued ranting about injustice and fake videos. Before they left, one of the officers apologized to me for what I'd been through. He said nobody should have to put up with that kind of treatment. After they left, the lot owner felt so bad about what happened that he gave me the tree for free. He kept apologizing like it was his fault, but I told him he handled everything perfectly by having those cameras. I loaded up my Christmas tree and drove home still shaking from the whole experience. When I told my wife what happened, she was shocked. We put up the tree that night and it looked beautiful in our living room. A few months later, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. Karen had been convicted of assault and battery and sentenced to community service and anger management classes. She also had to pay a fine and was banned from the Christmas tree lot permanently. That tree ended up being the most memorable Christmas tree we ever had. I've been at this company for 4 years, working my way up from basic floor staff to a senior position. We sold electronics and had to deal with all sorts of customers, but I genuinely enjoyed it because of my manager. Let's call him the good manager. This guy was everything you'd want in a boss. He supported his team, jumped in to help when things got busy, and actually cared about making sure we had what we needed to do our jobs well. When customers got difficult, he'd step in. When corporate made ridiculous demands, he'd shield us from the worst of it. Unfortunately, good managers don't stay in one place long in retail. Corporate noticed how well our store was running and decided they needed him to go fix another location that was struggling. We were all disappointed, but we understood. What we didn't know was what kind of replacement they'd send us. The timing couldn't have been worse for me personally. Just before the good manager left and the new one started, I had to have surgery. Nothing major, but it meant I'd be out for a week right during the transition. I was bummed about missing the chance to meet the new guy and get a feel for how things would change, but medical stuff comes first. About a week before the good manager left, I'd actually gotten a promotion. It came with a tiny pay raise. We're talking maybe 50 cents more per hour, but it also meant I was automatically put on a 6-month probation period. Company policy for any role change. At the time, I figured it was just a formality. So there I was, recovering from surgery, when I decided to go in on my day off to drop off my medical certificate and introduce myself to the new manager. I wanted to make a good impression and show I was committed to the job despite having to miss his first week. The moment I walked into the office, I knew something was off. The new manager barely looked up from whatever he was doing at his desk. When I explained who I was and handed over my paperwork, he just grunted and took it without even making eye contact. He told me coldly that I was the one who had been out sick during his first week. I apologized and explained that I'd had surgery scheduled months in advance. He said he didn't appreciate people disappearing right when he was trying to get a handle on things. I tried to smooth things over by saying I was looking forward to getting back to work and showing him what I could do, but he just nodded dismissively and went back to staring at his computer screen. When I came back to work, things got worse fast. The new manager had this habit of just sitting at his desk all day, staring at the security camera feeds. We're a customer-facing store, and sometimes we need manager approval for returns, discounts, or dealing with difficult customers. There's a bell system where we can call for management assistance. This guy would hear the bell, see us waiting with customers, and just ignore it. He'd sit there watching the cameras like it was his personal entertainment system. The laziness was just the beginning. This man took inefficiency to an art form. Tasks that should take 30 minutes would somehow take him an entire 8-hour shift. I watched him turn a simple stock check into an all-day project. He'd disappear into the stock room for hours, and when you'd go look for him, he'd be sitting on boxes, playing on his phone. Then there was the way he treated the female staff. It started with small things that made my skin crawl. He'd walk past me and breathe deeply right next to my ear. When I'd step away, he'd act like nothing happened. He made comments about how women couldn't handle certain tasks, despite the fact that I'd been doing those exact tasks successfully for years. The breaking point came during a particularly busy Saturday. We had a big shipment that needed to be processed, and I was already handling customer service and training a new employee. He assigned me to also do the heavy lifting in the stockroom. I told him I was already covering the floor in training that day and asked if someone else could handle the stockroom. That's when he said something that made my blood boil. He asked, "Why get a dog and bark yourself?" I was stunned and asked him to repeat what he'd just said. He told me I heard him correctly and to just get the work done. That night I went home and did some thinking. This guy clearly had no respect for me or any of the female staff. He was creating a hostile work environment, and his laziness was making everyone else's jobs harder. I also remembered something important. I was still in that 6-month probation period from my recent promotion. I stayed up late that night writing a very specific letter. Not a resignation letter, but a demotion letter. I was requesting to step down from my promoted position back to my previous role, effective immediately. Since I was in probation, I had every right to do this. The next morning I handed in my letter right at the start of my shift. The new manager looked confused and asked what the document was. I explained that I was stepping down from my current position back to my previous role, effective immediately, and that everything was properly documented. His face went through several expressions when he read the letter and realized what this meant. See, I was scheduled to be the key holder that evening with just one other junior staff member. Key holders have specific responsibilities that can't just be handed off to anyone. Someone with the proper authorization would need to stay. He protested that I couldn't just do this in the middle of a shift. I explained that I actually could since I was still in probation for the promotion, and company policy allowed for role changes during probation with immediate effect. I told him he'd need to find coverage for that night. He was the only other person available who could handle key holder duties on short notice. This meant he'd have to stay late, rearrange the schedule for the next 2 weeks, and basically do all the work he'd been avoiding. I wasn't done. That week I reached out to the regional manager and requested a transfer to another store. During that conversation I mentioned that I had concerns about the new manager's behavior toward female staff members. I explained that I had specific incidents documented and that the store's security cameras would back up my concerns. I made it clear that if the transfer wasn't approved, I'd be taking the matter to outside authorities. The regional manager said it was a serious accusation. I told him I had dates, times, and witnesses, plus the cameras captured audio in the main store area. The transfer was approved within a week. About a month after I'd moved to my new store, I got a call from my old co-worker. Apparently our entitled manager had been fired. The reason? He'd been caught having sex with someone in the customer bathroom during business hours. Security cameras caught him going in and out, and when corporate investigated, they found even more evidence of his inappropriate behavior. My former co-worker told me that after I left, several other female employees had come forward with their own stories about his creepy behavior. The combination of all our complaints, plus getting caught in such a disgusting act on company property, was enough to get him terminated immediately. I never did report him to the police for sexual harassment. Honestly, based on past experiences with law enforcement not taking these things seriously, I knew it would have been a waste of time. Seeing him lose his job and his reputation was satisfaction enough. My wife and I had been searching for our first family home for months. After years of cramped apartment living with our two young kids, we finally found a place we could afford. It wasn't fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms and a small garden. Most importantly, it had a shared driveway that came with 2 designated parking spaces according to the property deeds. The house inspection went smoothly, and we were excited about the move. The real estate agent mentioned that we'd be sharing the driveway with the neighbors in the larger house next door, but assured us that our parking spaces were clearly defined in the land registry documents. We made sure to get copies of everything, including the boundary lines and property rights. After dealing with landlords for years, we wanted to know exactly what we owned. Moving day was chaotic. The kids were running around while we tried to coordinate the movers, and I barely had time to wave at the elderly couple next door who were watching from their window. They seemed pleasant enough standing there in their matching cardigans. It took us about a week to settle in, but one thing became clear pretty quickly. We had a storage problem. The house was great, but there was nowhere to put the kids' bikes, scooters, and outdoor toys. Every night we had to drag everything into the narrow hallway, and every morning we'd trip over it, all trying to get out the door. The bikes were getting scratched up from being moved constantly, and my daughter was upset that her new pink bicycle was already looking worn. I spent a weekend researching small storage solutions and found these perfect compact bike sheds. They were only about 2 feet deep and 4 feet tall, designed for narrow spaces. They would sit completely on our portion of the driveway, well below the fence line, and wouldn't block anyone's access to anything. I decided to knock on their door and let them know about our plans. I figured it was just common courtesy, even though we didn't technically need their permission for something on our own property. The husband answered the door. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a pressed shirt even though it was Saturday morning. His wife appeared behind him, clutching what looked like a religious pamphlet. I introduced myself and explained that we were planning to install a couple of small bike sheds on our driveway. I made sure to mention that they were really compact and wouldn't cause any issues for their access or anything. He looked at me like I'd just suggested building a casino. He asked about bike sheds on the driveway with obvious disapproval in his voice. I confirmed that yes, we wanted small ones that would be entirely on our designated parking area according to the property deeds. I described how they would be about 2 feet deep and 4 feet tall, sitting below the fence line so they wouldn't be visible from their windows. His wife whispered something to him, and his expression grew stern. He told me that it would not be acceptable. I asked what he meant by not acceptable, explaining that the sheds would be on our property, well within our boundaries. He then said something that made my jaw drop. He told me I needed to understand that they owned the largest house on the street, which made them the senior household. He said that when it came to decisions about the shared area, he had the final say. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I just heard. I asked him to clarify what he meant by senior household, pointing out that the sheds would be entirely within our property lines. His wife stepped forward, nodding along. She explained that they had lived there for 35 years and knew what was appropriate for the neighborhood and what wasn't. She said that storage sheds were unseemly. The husband agreed completely. He said that they were the senior household. It was their responsibility to maintain standards. He told me that those sheds were not acceptable. I tried to stay respectful and pointed out that they didn't own our parking spaces. I mentioned that we had the deeds that clearly showed our property boundaries. That's when he said something even more ridiculous. He called me son and explained that size matters. He said that because their house was twice the size of ours, they had more say in community decisions. This wasn't a homeowners association. This was just a shared driveway between 2 separate properties. I told him I appreciated his concern, but we weren't asking for permission. We were just being courteous by letting him know our plans. His wife chimed in that being courteous would mean respecting their elders and the established residents of the street. The husband made his position clear once again. No bike sheds, and that was final. He started to close the door, but I stopped him. I wanted to be absolutely clear about what he was saying. I asked if he was really saying that because his house was bigger, he got to decide what we did on our own property. He said that was exactly what he was saying. We were supposed to recognize them as the senior household and act accordingly. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing there. I went back inside and told my wife what had happened. She thought I was joking at first. She couldn't believe he had actually said senior household, like he was some kind of neighborhood king. I told her his exact words and explained how he apparently thought having a bigger house gave him veto power over our property decisions. We pulled out all our property documents that night and went through them carefully. There was absolutely nothing giving the neighbors any authority over our parking spaces or what we could put on them. The boundary lines were crystal clear, and our designated area was entirely separate from theirs. The next weekend, I ordered the bike sheds online. They arrived 2 weeks later, and I spent Saturday morning assembling them. They looked perfect, exactly what I'd planned. Small, neat, and completely within our property boundaries. The kids were thrilled to finally have a proper place for their bikes. Around noon, I heard shouting from next door. The neighbor was yelling that this was unacceptable and that he had told me those sheds were not allowed. He was standing at his window, gesturing wildly. His wife appeared beside him, shaking her head dramatically. I walked over to the fence line and explained that the sheds were on our property, exactly where I said they'd be. They didn't affect his access or block his view. He shouted back that he was the senior household and that I had been told this was not acceptable. I reminded him that I had told him we weren't asking for permission. These were our parking spaces according to the legal documents. His wife threatened that they would see about that and announced they were calling the authorities. I told them to feel free and that I'd be happy to show whoever came our property deeds. They did call someone, though I'm not sure who. A few days later, a city inspector showed up to check that our sheds met local regulations. They did perfectly. He even complimented us on choosing such appropriate low-profile storage solutions. The inspector mentioned that the neighbors had complained about unauthorized construction, but when he explained that we were well within our rights and building codes, they apparently became quite upset about young people with no respect. It's been 6 months now and we haven't spoken to the neighbors since. They look at us from their windows sometimes, and I've noticed they've started parking their car close to our property line, though still technically on their side. The kids love their bike sheds, their bicycles stay clean and dry, and our hallway is finally clear. My daughter's pink bike still looks brand new. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.